Hello, and welcome to List 3100 Critical Thinking and Problem Solving, class lecture number 4. Here's our agenda. We'll review items from our previous lecture. We'll talk about some problem solving tips and techniques. We're going to talk about how to apply some of the theory you learned in our past lectures. We'll continue our introduction to critical thinking. You may recall that we began our lecture on chapter 1 last week. We'll finish that part of the lecture this evening, and we'll get into chapter 2 as well. Next week, we're going to have a graded quiz, and I want to talk to you about how to prepare for that quiz. Okay, let's do a quick review of our lecture 3 material from last week. We deal with two classes of problems. Those that are considered well-defined and those that are considered ill-defined. Well-defined problems have goals, a path to a solution, and obstacles that are clear based on the information given. You may recall last week you had that exercise where you calculated the price of a t-shirt that was on sale for 10% off. That's a good example of a well-defined problem. It had a path to a solution. That path to a solution was the arithmetic that you knew already. That was your path. You knew the goals. You knew that the shirt ordinarily cost, I think, $10 if I remember correctly, and you had to figure out how much it would cost if you had 10% off and had to pay taxes on that purchase as well. Ill-defined problems, on the other hand, are characterized by their lack of a clear path to a solution. They often lack a clear problem statement, making the task of problem definition and problem representation quite challenging. Remember, too, that ill-defined problems are more common than well-defined problems. To continue on well-defined problems, they have been studied extensively, and my thought is they've probably been studied more extensively than ill-defined problems simply because they're easier to study. You have a lot more to work with from the get-go. You know what the problem is. You know the path to the problem. All of those kinds of components of a well-defined problem that just simply aren't part of an ill-defined problem. Well-defined problems use algorithms to describe how each step of the problem is solved, and algorithms are like calculations, and the math, the arithmetic that you used in solving that t-shirt problem is an example of an algorithm. Once steps have been identified, the problem may be solved using a set of recursive operations or algorithms over and over again. In other words, if you encounter a similar problem again, you've already solved one problem using those same types of tools and techniques that you used before. So once you've solved one problem of that kind, it becomes quite easy to solve similar problems of that kind. For instance, think about when you were learning how to add a column of single-digit numbers, 2 plus 2, or 4 plus 4, or 3 plus 3. Once you learn that basic concept, once you figured out how to add 2 plus 2, then 3 plus 3, 4 plus 4, 5 plus 5 became much easier because you already knew how to get from point A to point B. Algorithms, on the other hand, cannot be used to solve ill-defined problems. Problems when we're dealing with ill-defined problems, they can't be easily defined as a set of smaller components. They're not easily broken down like well-defined problems are. Before a solution can be found to an ill-defined problem, we often have to come up with a radical change in representation of the problem. In other words, we have to turn the problem around and look at it from a lot of different angles before we could even recognize how to represent it mentally for us to solve it. Problem representation refers to the manner in which the information known about a problem is mentally organized. Mental representations are composed of 4 parts: a description of the initial state of the problem, In other words, what's the baseline? What is our starting point? A description of the goal state or end state. Where do we want to go? A set of allowable operators. So for instance, in our t-shirt problem, math was an allowable operator. We were allowed to use math because it was appropriate to solving that problem. And finally, the fourth part is a set of constraints. What things might obstruct our ability to get to a goal, an answer to our problem? By holding the information in memory in the form of a mental representation, the problem solver is able to remember more of the problem by chunking the information. So we can hold approximately 7 pieces of information about a problem in our mind at any given time. And as we work through those chunks, we start to combine them. And as we combine those chunks, they become less. In other words, we might start with 7 pieces of information, but we might chunk some of those pieces of information together, and we end up with essentially 3 pieces of information. It's usually easy to come up with a problem definition for well-defined problems, not so much obviously for ill-defined problems. Solutions to ill-defined problems must be determined by the problem solver. The goals must be specified before a problem-solving strategy can be developed. Most problems in the real world, as we already mentioned, are not well-defined, and experts spend more time with problem representation than do novices. Let's review some important definitions from last week. The first is convergent thinking. Convergent thinking occurs when we narrow down a set of ideas to converge in on the most appropriate one. The opposite of convergent thinking is divergent thinking. That takes place when we generate multiple ideas in order to generate a set of possibilities from which to choose. The last definition on this slide is incubation. That occurs when we try to solve a problem and we have difficulty with it and we decide to set it aside for a while. We go on to other things, and when we come back to the problem, surprisingly, we come up with a solution relatively quickly. And that's because even though we weren't consciously thinking about the problem when we set it aside, we were incubating that problem in our subconscious. Now let's talk about some problem-solving tips and techniques. The first I want to talk about is the Harvard Business School case study method. Harvard Business School is well known for using case study methodology in the school's MBA program. The approach consists of 5 steps. There is a video link that I'd like you to access. It goes into the Harvard Business School approach in more detail, but let me summarize those 5 steps here. Number 1 is students read the case and put themselves in the role of the decision maker. The second step is to identify the problem. The third is to perform necessary analyses. The fourth is to consider alternative courses of action. And the fifth is to suggest courses of action. Now, one of the things to remember about using the case study method is the analysis portion takes a lot more time than the solution portion. It takes a lot more time analyzing a problem than identifying the solution. Once you do an appropriate analysis, the solution almost automatically falls into your lap, so to speak. Flowcharts are another helpful resource in solving problems. Flowcharts are simply a visual representation of an algorithm, a workflow, or a process. In computer programming, we use something called pseudocoding, and that's a type of flowchart. Some of you may have had a basic computer coding course or another computer coding course, and you know what pseudocoding is, so you're already familiar with a type of flowchart. Here's another example of a flowchart. This is a flowchart that a human resource professional might use to recruit and hire an individual into a position. This flow chart is a good map for the human resource person to use in that process. And they probably came up with that flow chart by sitting down and in a sense, brainstorming all of the things, all of the components that go into hiring, recruiting, and hiring a person, and then fleshing that out through further analysis. Vincent Pareto was born in Italy in 1848. He was what we call a polymath. For those of you who don't know, a polymath is somebody who has expertise in a number of different fields. He had expertise in the fields of engineering. He actually got a degree in engineering, but he also had expertise in things like philosophy and music and economics, et cetera, et cetera. So Pareto came up with a chart that includes both a bar and a line chart. The bars in a Pareto chart show individual values in descending order from most to least, and the line represents the cumulative total. There's an example of a Pareto chart on the next slide that will make this more clear for you. And here's that example. As you can see, this is an example of perhaps some construction problems that you might have at your house. And if you look at this chart on the extreme left, as we saw on the last chart, the bars go from largest to smallest. And the line on the Pareto chart is the cumulative of all the bars. So on the left, we see that light bulbs might be the biggest problem we have in our house, in our construction project. There might be another electric issue that's the second most pressing issue, and on down to the miscellaneous area where we might have several different types of problems, but that miscellaneous section represents the smallest amount of problems that we have when it comes to our construction of our house. And the line chart at the top shows us that when you add up all of those bars at the bottom, it equals 100. And that's what a Pareto chart is. It's simply a combination of both a line chart and a bar chart. Many, if not all of you, are probably familiar with the technique of brainstorming. You probably have participated in some brainstorming activities, and if you have, you'll remember that there are some steps or rules that have to be followed in order for the brainstorming session to be as successful as possible. The first step is to create an atmosphere that encourages the free flow of ideas. You need to let people know that they should feel free to express their ideas during this session. In fact, you want to encourage people to shout out ideas and not feel self-conscious about their ideas. However, you do, as we see in step 2, want to keep the discussion focused. You still want to keep people on track in terms of what the goal of the session is, but you don't want to dissuade people from coming up with their creative ideas. Third step is to set a time limit. There is a point of diminishing returns. After a certain amount of time, there's not much value in continuing the brainstorming part of the session, the part where people shout out their ideas. Step 4 is to listen to everybody's ideas. That's in line with step 1. You want to listen with an open mind. You don't want to immediately just throw out a person's idea without at least giving it some thought and some attention. The 5th step is don't tune out when things don't go your way. So after the initial part of the brainstorming session, when people yell out ideas, then people start to call some of the ideas out, eliminate some of the ideas. Again, we're starting out you remember the difference between divergent and convergent. Divergent is where you come up with a whole bunch of ideas. Divergent is where you start with a bunch of ideas and whittle it down to a small uh, single best idea to solve a problem. That's what we're doing with brainstorming. We're using this diversion approach, but we start with everybody uh, having an opportunity to express their thoughts before we analyze those thoughts and then narrow it and focus it down to the best possible solution. Um, and once the final solution is made in step 6, we need to follow through with that solution. An Ishikawa diagram is a really good approach to figuring out causes and effects. And specifically, it helps us deal with what we call root causes of a problem. In any kind of a situation, let's say that a car crashes into a building and it damages the building. Well, the immediate cause of that damage was the car crashing into the building, but that's the immediate cause. We don't know why the car ran into the building. We need to find out what the root cause is to determine why the car ran into the building. And that's where Ishikawa diagrams or fishbone diagrams are really useful. And as you can see on this particular example, it looks like a fishbone. We start with these larger bones in the fish, the ones that are labeled in this particular diagram: marketing, support, infrastructure, trends, uh, viability, and competition. Those are the major possible causes of a problem. Once we get the major causes identified, then we add these smaller fish bones. So these larger areas are perhaps the major possibilities, but once we get those major possibilities, then we need to get down to the fine grain of those possibilities. In other words, looking at marketing, for instance, what is it about marketing? What are the things in marketing that could be a cause of uh, a drop in the app shortage, which is the problem that we're trying to solve here. Likewise, we identify issues with support and infrastructure that may be the root cause of a drop in app usage. So that's how a fishbone diagram is done. In a sense, it's almost like uh, brainstorming individually. You know, in brainstorming, we do it in a group, but in using an Ishikawa diagram, we do it as an individual, but we use that same technique of coming up with a whole lot of ideas at first, and then analyzing those ideas, and finally coming down to the one best. Well, in this case, we aren't coming up with a solution to the problem, but we are coming up with a cause. And once we come up with the cause, then we can come up with a solution. Mind mapping was developed by a gentleman named Tony Buzan in the 1970s. And this is kind of similar to an Ishikawa diagram. In this example on our slide, this is the problem we have is how to prepare for an exam. And what we do is we, again, use a convergent approach. We start by brainstorming individually all the ideas that we can think of in terms of what we have to do to prepare for an exam. So the person who developed this mind map, which by the way is a graphic representation, Ishikawa diagram uses mostly it does use a little bit of graphics in the lines, the fishbone, so to speak. But in mind mapping, you're encouraged to use a lot of symbols uh, and pictures, not so many words. This particular example uses a lot of words, but um, typically it's not done on a. There are computer programs that do mind mapping for you, and this particular example was probably done on a computer. But a lot of mind mapping is done on large pieces of flipboard paper with magic markers of different colors so that you can see the various different ideas and such. But it's a very good approach, and I've used it many times when I'm dealing with a problem or an issue, and it seems to help a lot um, in terms of narrowing things down to uh, the best possible approaches to solving a problem. Before moving into this next section on critical thinking, I do want you to look at um, the YouTube video um, on mind mapping that was linked on the last slide. The first few slides in this section of the lecture will be a review of some of the critical thinking topics that we covered in last week's lecture. First, our definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. To expand on the definition, critical thinking is systematic because first, it involves distinct procedures and methods. It's not just shoot from the hip kind of an approach. There are distinct procedures and methods to critical thinking. It entails evaluation and formulation because it's used both to assess existing beliefs, both yours and someone else's, and devise new ones. And the third bullet item, it operates according to rational standards in that beliefs are judged by how well they are supported by reasons. So to review some basics, critical thinking is not about what you think, but how you think. Critical thinking focuses not on what causes a belief, but on whether it is worth believing. The empowerment brought by critical thinking can take several forms. It offers skills for learning and exploring. It's essential to every intellectual endeavor, professional, and college course. It's a defense against error, manipulation, and prejudice. It's the best possible defense against clever marketers, dubious experts, skillful propagandists, etc. In fact, 2024 is an election year, so you're really going to have to uh, arm yourself against a lot of political ads. I don't care what you believe politically, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. Um, Everybody uses manipulation in political ads, so be on the lookout for that. Hopefully, this course will give you some tools and techniques to better arm you against those kinds of things. And finally, uh, critical thinking empowers us by giving us tools for self-discovery. It examines not only the ideas of others, but to your own ideas. It's important not just to criticize other people's ideas, but to be critical of your own. And not only be critical of your own ideas, but once you find a flaw in some of your beliefs, to change your way of thinking. And critical thinking gives us the power to do that. There's critical, then there's critical. By that I mean the critical in critical thinking does not mean fault finding or carping. It means exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation. Arguments. This is the most basic, perhaps most basic thing you need to know in critical thinking, because critical thinking uses arguments. Arguments are the main focus of critical thinking. An argument does not indicate a quarrel or heated exchange. That's usually what we mean when we say argument. But in critical thinking, it refers to the assertion of reasons in support of an argument. One of the two most important parts of arguments are premises. The other part is conclusions, and we'll get to that later. But premises are statements or reasons given in support of another statement. The statement that the premises are intended to support is called the conclusion. The process of reasoning from a premise or premises to a conclusion based on those premises is called inferences. It's important to know that an explanation is not an argument. An argument gives reasons for believing that something is the case. An explanation tells why or how something is the case. How do we know when a premise is present? Well, indicator words signal that a premise or conclusion is present. Common premise indicator words include because, in view of the fact, given that, seeing that, as, and there are more in your textbook. Common conclusion indicator words are therefore, thus, which implies that, consequently, and more in your textbook. Here's a tip for you. The best advice for trying to uncover or dissect arguments is to find the conclusion first. So look for some of those conclusion indicator words that we saw on the last slide and in the textbook that you'll find in the textbook. And once you find those indicator words, you'll find the conclusion. And if you find a conclusion, then you'll be able to uncover and dissect your arguments. Chapter 2 deals with obstacles to critical thinking. The author tells us that there are two main categories of impediments to critical thinking. The first is those that arise because of how we think. They typically come into play because of psychological factors, things such as fears, attitudes, motivations, and desires. We mentioned already today that 2024 is an election year, a presidential election year. How many people have an issue with thinking critically because they let their fear take over when it comes to an election? Fear of somebody in the other party winning and what might happen if that person wins, that kind of thing. So emotions often come into play when it comes to interfering with critical thinking. And then there's the type of impediment that occur because of not how we think, but what we think. And those typically arise because of philosophical ideas we have, our beliefs about our beliefs. In other words, we believe that our beliefs are correct. And so if we hold on to those beliefs without critically thinking about them and without being willing to change those beliefs, if we find flaws in those beliefs, then we're not really maximizing our critical thinking abilities. Another impediment to critical thinking is self-interested thinking. That occurs when we accept a claim because it advances or coincides with our interests. We may feel that, so-and-so is a better presidential candidate because people in that party typically, when their president is in power, the gas prices go down. And we have a business that where we run a lot of cars and machinery that depend on gasoline. And when the president is from the opposite party, that when gas prices are higher, that means that our costs are going to be higher. And so we accept that the person who represents the party with the lower gas prices is going to be the better president simply because it advances our current interest. We want lower gas prices, so we're going to vote for that person without critically thinking about who really is going to be the better president all the way around, all around. Another part of self-interested thinking is the temptation to accept claims for no other reason than they help you save face. So you might, I've been in situations where somebody says something really kind of silly and people laugh at them and they get embarrassed, but then they double down and they try to try to uh, save face by uh, continuing to argue their point, even though it's not an argument based on critical thinking. So how do we avoid self-interested thinking? Well, one way is to watch out when things get personal. Beware the urge to distort thinking to save face. Be alert to ways critical thinking can be undermined. Ensure nothing has been left out of consideration. Avoid selective attention, and make a conscious effort to look for opposing evidence. Group pressure is another form of impediment, and there's different types of group pressure. The first is peer pressure. That's when we conform to pressure from our peers. Another is appeal to popularity, pressure coming from mere popularity of a belief. How many times have you seen commercials, for instance, where you see 9 out of 10 people prefer the taste of a certain kind of margarine or something? I don't know. You see that kind of thing all the time. That's an appeal to popularity. Another is an appeal to common practice, and that occurs when pressure comes from what groups do or how they behave. Yet another impediment to critical thinking are philosophical obstacles, and those are of 3 types. The first is subjective relativism, and that is when we say the truth depends on what someone believes. Social relativism, truth is relative to society. So, at one time, most Americans thought that tomatoes were poisonous, believe it or not. But we know now that that's not true, and that's because science has shown that tomatoes are not poisonous, et cetera, et cetera. But that's an example of social relativism. That was a truth that was true to our society in, I don't know, the 1910s. I don't know when it ended, but I actually had my major professor in my master's degree program told our class that he was alive when he was younger. People thought tomatoes were poisonous, so it wasn't all that long ago that people thought tomatoes were poisonous. A third type of philosophical obstacle is skepticism. That's about how much we really know. At the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that you're going to have a graded quiz next week. Let's talk a little bit about that quiz. First of all, the quiz will be graded, and it's worth 10% of your final grade. The quiz will include 10 multiple choice questions. You may recall on the practice quiz that you had, I think, 5 multiple choice questions. These 10 multiple choice questions will be the same kind of questions. Some of them may be the same exact question, but you get the idea. They're going to be the same exact kind of question that you had on that practice quiz. But I've been giving the final exam some thought, and I'm a little concerned. This is what we call an asynchronous course, so I won't be able to administer the exam to you in person. I mean, I guess there's a possibility that we could all get together someplace and I could administer an exam, or everybody could go to a campus, a Tennessee Tech campus, and have Proctor administer exam. But I'd rather you just have the opportunity to take the exam at home. I'm thinking about using a short answer essay approach to the final exam. So there wouldn't be that many questions, maybe 4 or 5 short answer essay questions. You would answer each of those with maybe 2-3 paragraphs each. So it wouldn't be, like a term paper. You wouldn't be writing that much, but you'd probably be writing a good 3 to 4 pages of typed answers to the questions on the final. And I wanted to see how you would do on that type of question. So I'm including three short answer essay, or I'm sorry, I'm including 2 short answer essay questions on the quiz next week. But to be fair, I don't want to have people get penalized if they don't do so well on those short answer essay questions on the quiz next week. So what we'll do is if you score 9, 10, 11, or 12 on the quiz next week, you'll get an A. You'll get credit for 100% on the quiz. Okay. If you get 8 correct, you'll get a 80%. 7 correct, 70%, 60% for 6 correct, etc., etc. But I don't want to, if you get 8, if you get all 10 of your, multiple choice questions correct next week and flub the 2 short answer essay questions, I didn't want to penalize you for that. So, we'll see how you do on that. And if you do okay on those short answer essays, that's probably how we'll do the final exam. I'm going to reserve the right to figure out how best to administer the final exam. We may have to use proctors, and you may have to go to a Tennessee Tech campus to take that final. I just don't know. Hopefully we'll be able to do it remotely. All that being said, please continue with your reading. Continue reading the textbook. Hopefully or not hopefully, but we will be getting into chapter 3 of the critical thinking textbook next week. And I also want you to begin reading let's skip over chapter 4 for now. I want you to read up on fallacies and persuaders for next week. That's kind of a fun chapter, and we use a lot of different kinds of videos, YouTube videos, short. They're usually they're mostly like 3 or 4 minute videos, but they're really fun videos that underscore some of these fallacies. So please read chapter 3. If you haven't already finished chapter 2, make sure you finish chapter 2 as well. And the quiz, by the way, will only cover what we've covered so far, only the first 4 lectures. We're not going to cover anything from chapter 3 in the textbook, for instance. That's your assignment for next week, so don't worry about that for the quiz. All that being said, have a good, safe week, and hopefully you'll do well on your quiz next week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.